Welcome back to today's Explainer. We're jumping straight into a hard-nosed due diligence teardown of what's been hyped as the ultimate climate tech promise, green ammonia. Right now, a massive wave of capital is flooding the climate tech space, but for portfolio managers and investors watching this, you know the drill. You desperately need to separate the utopian visions from the realistic timelines. So today, we're mapping out the exact commercial risks and the real-world feasibility of this promised disruption.
And that brings us to the billion-dollar question driving your asset allocation. Is this tech actually ready to solve the impending 2026 global food crisis, or is your investment timeline totally broken? Look, it is incredibly easy to get swept up in the promise of decarbonization, but if the macro environment doesn't support the rollout, well, you're basically just funding a very, very expensive science experiment.
So to figure that out, we're going to break down the exact financial and logistical metrics. We'll start with the green ammonia pitch, look at the massive scale problem, dig into the unviable unit economics, check the timelines and regulatory risks, and finish up with near-term market alternatives.
All right, let's start with the pitch itself. The utopian vision. The bull case here is incredibly compelling, permanently decoupling our global food security from fossil fuels.
From a purely technological standpoint, this is basically the CapEx holy grail. And the crazy thing is, the tech to do this is already proven. In theory, you take immense renewable electricity generation, use that pristine power for electrolysis to split pure water into hydrogen and oxygen. Then you feed that green hydrogen directly into the century-old Haber-Bosch process, combining it with atmospheric nitrogen. Just like that, you are literally manufacturing the fundamental building blocks of modern agriculture out of thin air, water, and sunlight. Theoretically, any country with wind or solar could produce its own fertilizer without relying on natural gas, coal, or those highly vulnerable maritime choke points.
Sounds amazing, right? But here's where we hit the trough of disillusionment. Right now, today, green ammonia accounts for less than 0.1% of global production. The vast, overwhelming 99.9% majority of this market is completely locked into fossil fuels. Now, sure, green ammonia works beautifully in heavily monitored pilot plants, but it is nowhere near the commercial scale needed to feed 8 billion people. For you as an investor, bridging that gap from a tiny pilot phase to dominant market share, that represents an almost unfathomable amount of capital friction and execution risk.
Which brings us to the massive scale problem. Pivot with me to the bear case for a second, because the physical requirements to scale this up are absolutely staggering.
Think about 185 million tons. That's not just a production metric. That is your total addressable market. That's the current global ammonia production required every single year. And virtually all of it relies on a finely tuned, highly optimized fossil fuel supply chain. We aren't just trying to disrupt some niche energy market here. We are talking about completely rebuilding the bedrock of the global food supply from scratch. Disruption at this scale is incredibly sensitive. Any friction directly impacts whether people eat.
Let's run the math on replacing just 10% of that market. Producing a single ton of green ammonia takes about 8 to 10 megawatt hours of electricity. To replace 18.5 million tons, you'd need an eye-watering 150 to 185 terawatt hours of dedicated, new renewable electricity every single year. That translates to 60 to 75 gigawatts of solar or wind capacity. To put that into perspective, you'd basically have to build out the entire renewable grid of a medium-sized industrialized nation solely and exclusively to satisfy just 10% of global fertilizer demand.
And here is a crucial point for your risk models. This power has to be completely additional. You can't just divert existing electricity from residential grids or factories to make fertilizer. If you do that, you instantly trigger a massive energy crisis and severe political backlash. So your capital expenditures for green ammonia must include 100% new power generation. You're effectively forced to build a massive energy company and a massive chemical company at the exact same time. It totally doubles your infrastructure burden.
Let's move on to the unviable unit economics, because this is where those commercial dreams crash right into financial reality. Take a look at this spread. For capital allocators, this is the valley of death for commercialization. Conventional gas-based ammonia costs roughly $250 to $400 per ton under normal market conditions. Green ammonia, it's sitting anywhere from $600 to $1,200 per ton. You're looking at a 200 to 300% premium. For a global commodity market that historically runs on extreme volume and razor-thin margins, a baseline cost approaching $1,200 is just fundamentally incompatible with standard agricultural economics. The bottom line here is stark. Without aggressive market-shifting subsidies that just don't exist yet, this cost barrier is entirely prohibitive. Unless global carbon pricing suddenly skyrockets or governments step in with unprecedented financial interventions that fundamentally warp the market, that green premium is an insurmountable hurdle for unsubsidized capital. The open market simply will not absorb a 300% markup on the foundational building block of the global food supply chain, not when cheaper alternatives are flowing freely.
But let's say you can stomach those prohibitive costs. We still have to look at the timelines and regulatory risks, specifically the macro environment headwinds.
Right now, the International Fertilizer Association is explicitly warning the market about mixed decarbonization signals. And for an investor, mixed signals mean one thing: stranded asset risk. Capital is actively sitting on the sidelines because global regulatory frameworks are dragging their feet. Think about it. If mechanisms like the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism get delayed or watered down, a newly built multi-billion-dollar green ammonia plant suddenly loses its artificial competitive edge. Without ironclad, long-term regulatory guarantees penalizing carbon, holding an incredibly expensive, uncompetitive asset is just way too risky.
And the timelines just do not line up. When we map out these mega projects currently making headlines, like NEOM's $8.4 billion plant in Saudi Arabia or those massive prospective hubs in Oman and Australia, there's a glaring mismatch. The key takeaway for you here is the severe disconnect between our immediate crisis timelines and actual infrastructure deployment. These projects are targeting their very first trickle of production between 2028 and 2030. Meaningful commercial scale won't hit until the mid-2030s. And driving real global market impact, that's realistically a 2040 story. They fundamentally missed the immediate 2026 supply crisis entirely. Near-term capital needs a completely different home.
So, if green ammonia is decades away from moving the needle, what are the near-term market alternatives? Where is the pragmatic playbook telling capital to flow today?
To solve our immediate structural vulnerabilities, the smart money is moving pragmatically. Unlike those green megaprojects, expanding existing conventional facilities takes just 1 to 2 years. Diversifying new gas and coal plants outside of vulnerable Gulf choke points takes 3 to 5 years. But honestly, perhaps the most exciting immediate opportunity is the massive push into efficiency and precision agriculture. We're talking about huge software and hardware investment opportunities that can reduce fertilizer waste by up to 20% right now. You're solving supply constraints through efficiency without having to wait a decade for new chemical plants to come online. Ultimately, the most honest policy and investment response is a barbell strategy. On the short-term side of the barbell, capital absolutely must fund conventional supply chain resilience and strategic fossil reserves right now. We have to stop the bleeding and ensure global food security. But on the long-term side of the barbell, venture capital and sovereign wealth funds have to simultaneously handle those long-tail moonshots, funding green ammonia development to ensure we eventually reach true independence. It's a classic both-and scenario. The ultimate takeaway for any serious analyst looking at this space is that green ammonia is the right answer to the wrong question at the wrong time. Unwinding a decades-old fossil fuel fertilizer dominance is simply going to take decades to achieve. The technology is a beautiful, completely necessary vision shimmering on the horizon, but it cannot and will not solve the immediate supply chain threats we are facing over the next 36 months.
So I'm going to leave you with this. Should governments be massively increasing green ammonia investment right now, despite these decades-long timelines, or must that capital be diverted to immediate, conventional food security? Can we actually afford to wait? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you in our next explainer as we tackle export restriction dominoes.